Hola, molt bona tarda. Benvinguts a l'últim divendres de Model, Festival d'Arquitectures de Barcelona. És un gran plaer presentar un debat més, una instal·lació més d'aquest festival que intenta articular a través d'instal·lacions a l'espai públic i també de debats com podem repensar les ciutats del futur i com podem entendre aquells potencials que tenim a la ciutat del present. Estem avui a la instal·lació Superfície Salvatge, que és un projecte de Harrison Atelier, de Lourie Harrison, una arquitecta, pensadora, investigadora que durant els últims 10 anys ha estat produint projectes d'investigació, de recerca pedagògics i també físics que intenten transformar la nostra percepció de què vol dir ser un arquitecte a una societat multiespècies. L'Ariane, potser quan ens vam trobar per primera vegada fa molts i molts d'anys, estava treballant en un nicho, en un espai que molt pocs arquitectes en aquell moment estaven interessats. Crec que la societat en els últims 10 anys ha sigut capaç de desenvolupar agendes de treball, d'investigació i de recerca que fiquen al centre del seu espai d'investigació no els humans, sinó les altres espècies. L'Ariane va ser una de les 5 guanyadores del Premi Model a l'experimentació arquitectònica, un concurs internacional que va rebre més de 100 propostes de més de 20 països i de 60 ciutats d'arreu del món i que va tenir el suport del jurat per la seva capacitat d'entendre una de les grans prioritats, que és entendre l'arquitectura més enllà dels humans. I tenim un gran plaer tindre a l'Ariane aquí avui, que ens ha arribat aquest matí des dels Estats Units. Moltíssimes gràcies, Ariane, per ser aquí. També vull aprofitar aquesta ocasió per presentar a l'Areti. L'Areti és una arquitecta d'aquesta ciutat, però també és una arquitecta grega que ha transformat el que és la idea d'investigació i recerca a una institució educativa i cultural d'aquesta ciutat, l'Institut Avançat d'Arquitectura de Catalunya, i que des de la distància, des dels anys en què ens hem anat conegut a través de la distància, jo crec que l'Eti ha fet una transformació increïble, des d'entendre el potencial d'allò digital, de les innovacions tecnològiques, a entendre aquesta transformació dintre d'un context d'una ecologia planetària on inclou diferents formes de vida, humanes, no humanes i etc. L'Areti ha sigut una de les comissàries de l'última bienal o trienal de Tallinn, juntament amb una gran amiga comú, la Lídia Calipoliti, que també va participar en un dels esdeveniments de l'Ariane Lourie Harrison, i que és un plaer tindre a l'Areti aquí, tenint conversa, compartint idees, aspiracions sobre quin és el treball que ella està desenvolupant i com ens relacionem avui en dia dintre d'un context global de l'arquitectura, de la pedagogia, dintre d'un espai local com és aquest, la ciutat de Barcelona, a sobre d'aquesta estructura de pàrquing que estava normalment abandonadíssima i que des del primer moment que aquestes plantes van entrar en aquesta superfície salvatge van començar a habitar-les. Doneu-me, sisplau, l'ajuda en donar-los la benvinguda en un fort aplaudiment. Gràcies per ser aquí. Thank you.
Good evening, and thank you, Eva, Saul, Ty, for this incredibly inspired and inspiring session between species. I am honored and delighted to be part of this program along with our guest speakers. Okay. Just a word about tonight's program. So we are discussing building for multiple species. We'll begin with a discussion between Areti and myself, following brief presentations of both of our works. This will be followed by a strawberry break. Strawberries are fruit that are pollinated mainly by native bees, and you will have a little refreshment, followed by a series of presentations by Christian Alonso, Albena Yaneva, and Madeleine McGowan, and a discussion. Afterwards, we are delighted that we will have a performance by Acute, and that will really wrap up this evening's program. One thing I should mention, I will be discussing this installation, which is a landscape made of mycelium-based bee habitats. These are small panels. Each one is a bee habitat. And on April 30th, at the end of the closing party, we will give them away to everybody to encourage you to put a panel in your garden and see if a native bee should inhabit. I think Eva mentioned, but I am an architect who builds for multiple species. This has been a focus of my firm, Harrison Atelier. What you see behind me are a series of works that span from performance work, where we try to represent the non-human, to increasingly, as the years go by, we seem to become more and more realistic, more pragmatic about how do we build habitat for multiple species. We learned very rapidly that in trying to build a habitat for birds and bees, called the birds and the bees, that the birds ate the bees. So we tried to specialize more. And now what I will be talking about today is a practice that is very much focused on insects, pollinating insects, and namely wild bees, or they call them native bees. These are not bees that make honey or have hives. And I wanted to also mention, sorry, I just realized it's right in front of me, that my practice, in addition to my practice, I teach. And I teach at several schools. I teach at the Yale School of Architecture. I teach at the Weitzman School of Design at UPen. And I teach urban design at Pratt Institute. This event has been a way to bring people with whom I have been in long dialogues with, like Albena and Madeline, into dialogue here in Barcelona, and you'll see some student work behind me in this installation. The strawberries that you will receive, I just wanted to mention, these are one example of fruit that is pollinated primarily by native bees. It's one of the reasons I work on native pollinators is because they are directly tied to our food source. If you imagine that 75% of our food really depends on insect pollination. Most agriculture uses honeybees, but they have been stricken by a number of diseases, colony collapse, and really a series of issues that mimic what happens with our migrant human labor. Industrialized labor in any condition for a human or for a non-human is equally destructive. So it is one reason why people are focused increasingly on native bees that are native to every continent, to try to continue our agricultural practice and our food source. So it is estimated that there are about 20 to 30,000 species of native bees on Earth. These are pollinators that do not produce honey, they don't live in hives, and they don't sting. As you can see, there are many different sizes, they're different colors. Some of you may be very familiar with a honeybee, but these are a delightful, very diverse set of bees that are responsible for really the pollination of the flowering trees around us, really everything that you see in your environment. This bee, the mason bee, is an incredibly effective pollinator as well. So one of these mason bees can do the work of 100 honeybees in one day. So there are other reasons to support these from an economic perspective. On the Iberian Peninsula, there are an estimated 1,100 species of native bees. Many of these bees are solitary, and they nest underground or in any holes that they can find. So they'll nest in tubes, for example, as you see here. Spain is very rich in wild bees, as this recent exhibition at the Jardin Botanique demonstrates. And but where we are today is we understand that the European Red List of Bees reveals large gaps in information, large gaps in knowledge about Spanish bees, but there are really large gaps about knowledge in native bees across the globe. This is not, this is a planetary situation. For architects, bees have always captured a certain human imagination of society being very well structured, well organized, of having clear social strata in which a queen rules a class of workers and they are obedient, and the geometry of their environment reflects this incredibly tightly ordered system. The bees I like are very different from that. The native bees who make nests, these bees are single mothers. They lay 3 to 6 eggs in a nest. In this, what you see, this tube is actually a nest for a number of eggs. They fly from nest to flower. They live and work alone. And unlike honeybees that fly up to 12 kilometers for food, solitary bees, they can't really forage further than 50 meters. So one length of this installation is 50 meters. One of the things this installation does in its square length is give you a real sense of this is the distance between the food and the bee, and the solitary bee cannot really fly any further with that. The leafcutter bee that you see here cutting a circle out of a leaf is also intensely local, and you might find in that form, that round cut, something that mimics the shape of this installation, in which we sought to make the leafcutter's bees markings a little bit more visible to you. The panels of this installation are, they are, let me see, about, I guess that is about 20 centimeters. They each have one hole. The hole has each hole is about 10 centimeters long, and they go diagonally through the panel. These holes are habitats. Each bee is a solitary bee. It prefers to live alone in a hole. So consider that every panel here is a habitat for one bee that we will encourage you to take home and make a home for them in your garden. But the hole, the simple hole, is something that I'm very interested in. It is actually incredibly vulnerable in the city. If you look around you at this paved surface, it is very difficult to maintain a hole for any amount of time in the city. It gets raked over, it gets paved over, it gets reworked, and that is, in our thinking, one idea of what architecture can do is provide a framework, provide a way to protect the habitat, protect the whole that is the habitat. And that is one reason I'm obsessed by panels, by small facade elements that are, in essence, the framing of a whole to protect it, so that it is a viable habitat for another species. This kind of, I think Eva was mentioning the transformation of this surface. This is almost a motif of a city surface, a concrete slab that's extensive, that can be very hot. We were extremely grateful to Eva for providing us with this provocative site that really inspired us to try to turn it into something green, something like a living landscape that could host what you see on the left, you know, a simple hole that could host a habitat. I'm going to now go through a couple of our early works. You will see an obsession of holes. We make holes, we clad them in concrete, and for us, the design is how you translate the habitation that is within the hole to a human audience so that these habitats can be protected. So this was work we did at Claremont, New York, as a little pavilion covered with concrete panels that had habitats within. The hole, as I mentioned, is our obsession, but it is what connects us directly to the solitary bees. So you can see different size bees have different size holes. They like different things, and you can really program your spaces for different bees according to the aperture size of the entry hole. These habitats can serve a variety of insects. We are certainly under no illusion that we know what ends up living in these habitats. And it may be that a songbird takes nest instead. And so you see these little twigs. That is an indication that a bird has taken habitat in this panel. One of the things that we try to do in our work is create a much more playful habitat for children to learn about these different species, to be able to engage at close range with these bees that I'll insist several times, they really don't sting. The worst they do is bite you if you put your finger in their nesting tube, which you should not do. So they are very child-friendly, and this engagement with children and with different publics is part of our interest in trying to create spaces. For example, this is work with the Bee Conservancy, where we're trying to demonstrate the interaction of human, non-human, and what you see here, this boy is looking at an iPhone that shows him what the camera is looking at, the camera trained over the bee habitat. We teach with our structures, and we teach that solitary bees are gentle neighbors. They can coexist with children, so these are my daughters who are playing with the surface of one of our pavilions called the Pollinators Pavilion in Hudson, New York. And this habitat, this is a visitor center. Bees do not need to live in a concrete covered dome. We are doing a large structure like this for humans to draw attention to native bees for humans. What bees need is that simple habitat, but this also serves as a visitor center for Stonehouse Farms in Hudson, New York. So people come, it's a performance space. It's a space that we are very honored to be on the site of a farm that used to be a pesticide testing site. So some of our sites, probably like this site, has a certain legacy that's important to counter in our design. The interior, as I mentioned, can play on histories of domed architecture, but it's really the exterior that is designed for other species. So what you see here is a concrete panel. They're nesting tubes in that, I can't find the laser. So they're nesting tubes, the little tubes, and above it, the black thing is a camera. That camera is trained over the bees, and that camera is connected to a microprocessor. The white wire is connected to a solar array above. But what this is a setup of a monitored bee habitat. So it takes photographs of bees. Why? Because we are trying to contribute not just habitat, but also information on solitary bees. So I mentioned earlier that there's scientific gaps. There's gaps in scientific literature on native bees. We are part of an effort that tries to capture images, run them through an AI model to automate identification of bees. This is part of really where a lot of entomology is going. This is just showing you the camera end. When you click onto the QR code over there, you will see a number of cameras. When you click on the camera, it looks like this. This is what it looks like to monitor a bee. That's why we think it's great for something very patient, like a microprocessor, to do so. And what I'm showing you here, and I realize you can't probably read this, but what you see at the end of this article is a statement about AI providing the effective, continuous, and non-invasive observation of species. So this is, scientists agree that this is an incredibly important use for AI. We ask, why isn't this an incredibly important use for the surfaces of buildings? Why do the surfaces of buildings just stand there and do nothing except for represent they represent to other humans. We feel the surfaces of buildings can be transformed to become effective, continuous, and non-invasive observers of nature. That becomes increasingly important when we understand we are in the middle of a collapse of insects and understand how little we actually know about insects. So you see here 1% of insects have been assessed, while insects are by far the largest class. So we think that according to German studies that we have lost about 75% of insect life over the last 50 years, but we don't know. we don't actually know. And so our argument is that let's have our buildings start to contribute to that knowledge. I'll shift gears a little and talk about the mycelium. So we have used mycelium. We experiment with it in our office. You see a 3D printed mold, and we cast the mycelium into it. This is sometimes what it takes to remove the mycelium from the mold. And when you take it out, the white is actually mushroom. It's mycelium. This is a mycelium-infused hempcrete that is much more sustainable than the kind of concrete that we have tended to use in some of our panels. So we are trying to find more ecological material. And we are proposing this as an entrance for Governor's Island, the Bee Pavilion, the Bee Conservancy, sorry. It's an entrance for this organization that is dedicated to native bees. And again, I'm showing you, this is what we're arguing is the unit of care, or we could say radical empathy might begin at the scale of a panel, at the scale of a unit like this, which is a habitat, but it is also a monitored habitat. It also connects to the scientific intelligence that may eventually change policy, that may have much bigger effects than a few habitats on a building might affect. The mycelium panels here, they were, if you pick, I will encourage all of you to pick them up and smell them. They still smell like mushroom. And they were grown in a wine cellar here in Barcelona. So this is a very living material designed to be used for a habitat of very fragile species. This is the final part of my talk. We'll just offer a vision for the city in a century that has begun with what we've seen: extreme weather, earthquakes, war, and species extinction. So the city, as opposed to the countryside or a scape of agricultural or industrial use, is actually becoming increasingly important as a place for biodiversity to flourish. This is one article among many that indicate that cities can be and are becoming biodiversity hotspots. In New York City, for example, we find falcons and hawks perching on air conditioners. We find coyotes on roofs. And this is part of our work that would argue that we need to see cities as a space, as spaces to be reclad, rehabited, not just rewilded, but in a view of historic adaptation of building fabric, to clad them with paneling that can serve more than one species. As the human population increases, and the UN projects 9.8 billion by 2050, and the planet urbanizes, so we think about 70% of humans will be living in cities, again, by 2050. I think 2050 is not far away, and it will be interesting. We argue that cities are actually vital places to begin seeding resilience in this period of dramatic climate change. In my writing, I mentioned the French philosopher Jacques Rancière and his insight that the political appears when those who are not officially counted make themselves seen and heard. That politics itself involves being seen, being perceived, and being counted. So this is really why our work has so many panels of of individual wholes. We are counting the species. We are trying to develop an architecture that can be political in its count of those that are not yet counted. For us, this is a critical space for architecture. The surfaces of buildings can become a public representation of these different species. This, incidentally, is what we proposed to Eva at the beginning of our discussions with Eva, that we would clamber on a number of rooftops and stealth build mycelium habitats. I think this site was a far more generative site, but I think it's also important to understand that Barcelona's Biodiversity Atlas and the Spanish National Council for Research are part of the many initiatives here that are recording and preserving bee fauna. So my last slide shows our team, to which I owe a great deal of thanks for their working behind the scenes. You see our team has designers. We have an AI team based out of Georgia Tech. We have a series of scientific advisors that are entomologists. There is no way we feel as architects that we can know the details about what one needs to know to build habitat for other species, and we've really enjoyed a way of working that is interdisciplinary and collaborative. So with that, I want to again thank Saul, Eva, Ty, the incredible team at Model, Ana Ramos, and the incredible production team at Hotaru, who has helped us so much. And a warm thank you to tonight's presenters as well. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Ariane. I think now it's my turn to take the microphone. Thank you, first of all, for driving the curiosity of Eva and the team in terms of proposing a solution that could actually promote a design process more than anything. That, to me, is important to realize that it's a design process which is not anymore the traditional top-down design process of a designer or a team of designers with certain desires towards a specific audience of clients. No, the fact that we are definitely opening up a new paradigm of design that is not just, in my opinion, includes other species such as insects or animals, but also a variety of intelligence, which is why I name my talk today Collective Intelligence, a variety of intelligence that starts, of course, from human and cognitive intelligence, open up to animal or insect, but as well as vegetable or microbial intelligence. So besides that, what I would also like to discuss today from my side as a contribution is the importance, on one hand, on rethinking our design process towards a collective intelligence co-design process, but also defining these different intelligences and how we can design with them, no? Because, as I said, animals and insects are one of these, but not the only ones. So when we are talking about the idea of realizing these interdependencies among species, I think a very important thing that we're doing is to actually go a step further from the traditional or the notion of metabolism that we had during, let's say, modernism, that we were understanding metabolism as a collection of inhabitable machines. We're taking a step further towards a metabolism that is a kind of a new wide of life and death, but also a new paradigm that introduces how we define materials, how we define resources, how we define also the distribution of these resources. And I think it's also very important that, in a way, we realize that design has such a big power that could eventually rethink or even react upon what we have considered as a metabolism. And rather than creating an architecture that is mimicking the living, what we can actually do is like create an architecture that bursts into life, no? That is alive, and it has biological operations integrated into what we have considered as artificial or synthetic making. And that is why I also think that this parking spot is fantastic, no? Because it merges that kind of old paradigm of synthetic, gray, concrete infrastructures together with a new kind of scale, which I also like why you're obsessed with holes and components. It introduces a new scale paradigm, but also, of course, new materiality. I wanted to go through a series of projects that maybe represent some kind of ideas of this intelligence. So animal intelligence, and this is a project that we have been doing together with our researchers and our students at IAC that is actually about pollination, and it's about bees, and it's about rethinking the building surfaces, you know. It's a bit weird, but do you know that bees have been prohibited? I mean, until very, very few time ago, bees were prohibited in Barcelona. How can we prohibit bees? No? Well, we can, it seems. But of course, there are now, as you said, a series of different initiatives. But an important thing to highlight here is the fact that the urban environments, as Ariane said, becomes a very appropriate environment for certain species to thrive. Bees, or pollinators, have much more chances to survive in an urban environment if we offer a supportive infrastructure rather than in agricultural areas, massive agricultural areas that there are a lot of, for example, chemical substances or fertilizers. So if we are able to provide these habitable spaces, but also if we are able to provide nutritional support for the bees, then we would be able to allow the species to thrive. In the work that we have been doing, we were trying to combine different aspects which are very much related, first of all, to use technological species, to use digital intelligence in order to map the different areas, green corridors, green areas in the Barcelona and the metropolitan area, so that we can actually understand how we can connect this kind of flows of pollinators towards the city. Because as you've said, there is a certain limited range on the fly of these insects, no? So we have mapped on the one hand Barcelona and the metropolis, and on the other hand, we created a digital simulator so that we can understand where exactly we could actuate in the city of Barcelona, taking into consideration that we need certain square meters of surfaces, but also taking into consideration that we need surfaces that they are probably blind or open spaces as these ones. And the additional thing that we try to do is how we can integrate into the creation of these new habitable spaces in our building facades materials that can also come from waste, materials that can be found from our byproducts of our urban activity. So here what we have been doing is creating components, models, not only one hole, but various, because we have some research that shows that we need an entrance, but we also need an exit, so we need a kind of two different holes. But here, the important thing is to use cellulose-based materials in order to upcycle our waste and create habitats for other species by adding a new aesthetic parameter in our built environment. What is also important here is that we started to cook our materials, no? Ariane is growing mycelium, we're cooking different materials, we are adding some sugar and syrup so that this becomes a kind of a nutrient for bees, but we are also creating certain thicknesses on the material so that we can create this kind of insulation process, that thermal insulation and humidity and temperature, let's say, conditions that the bees need. So it becomes a kind of a combination of different parameters that we use to design, as Ariane well said. And this is a video which, is it playing? Oh, I thought it was not functioning. It was a video that more than the image, there is a moment where we can actually hear the sound, because that also affects the soundscape of our cities.
Bees are mysteriously dying.
Colony collapse disorder.
Colony collapse disorder.
Colony collapse disorder.
End of honeybees, the end of pollination, a dire threat to crops the world over.
So there are different tools that we can actually use for monitoring or for designing for other species. And maybe I will just try to find my next slide. But another intelligence that I wanted to discuss about beyond, I jumped too many slides. Beyond the animal or the insect one is the vegetable intelligence. As Eva said, I had co-curated together with Lydia Kallipoliti the Tallinn Architecture Biennale on the theme of edible, or the architecture of metabolism. And one of our goals there was to try to rethink the design processes towards co-design with vegetables, with vegetable intelligence, so that on the one hand, we can bring food production back to cities. But on the other hand, we can also start thinking the byproducts of our food production and distribution system as a new resource that could be brought back to the cycle of the built environment. So within that exhibition, we envisioned a metabolic home, a home that rethinks our domestic spaces, our lounge, our kitchen, our garden, our dining table, and how the outputs of one space becomes inputs or nutrients for another one to operate. If we think about nature, it doesn't recognize the idea of waste. On the contrary, all the outputs of a system become a new nutrient or a new input for another system. So how does this vegetable intelligence could actually allow us to rethink not only exterior surfaces, but also the spaces that we inhabit? This was a project from Terraform One, and we asked them to do the lounge, and what they have come up is with a solution of using puffed rice, so that they create an envelope that is edible. So on the one hand, it becomes a kind of food storage for urgency, but on the other hand, of course, increases biodiversity, because that envelope is being slowly eaten by different mammals, insects, and birds. So the idea of using food or food waste to provide food for other species is something also very interesting. In the garden, this is a project that we did from the IAC side. In the garden that represented the production of food, we wanted to understand how we can create big-scale, let's say, transformations of building skins into vertical food farms. And for that, we realized that there is certain limitation in terms of maintenance or in terms of monitoring the health of the different plants and the soil nutrients. So we actually create a combination of maintenance or care by the people and by machines, by robots that were able to sense in real time all these necessities of the plants and be able also to irrigate if necessary or to fertilize if necessary. And this again, you know, like it's in a way, how can we transform our urban environments into more productive ones, but also what are the mediums that we need to do that in terms of tools, design tools or technology tools. In this project we called Comida, and then it became the vertical food farm. It has been supported by the Hàbitat here in Barcelona. It has been selected as a project to be co-financed within the Ciutat Reactiva challenge. And what we wanted to do here is to try to work together with the community, so to bring also the crowd intelligence or the human intelligence into that co-design process of farming, because at the end of the day they also need to take care of them, no? They also need to maintain this kind of spaces. So of course we digitally designed and simulated, but we also started creating customized 3D printed components that each one of them has a different serves a different scope. One could be a bird bath or a bird house. It can also be shelter for insects, and we even have shelter for bats, which we also know that they are important in the pollination process. So the computational design and digital fabrication processes such as 3D printing allow us to customize each piece with the same cost or with the same speed of manufacturing. And then this kind of micro textures that the additive manufacturing technique can give us, it also serves in order to become shelter for microorganisms and moss, and therefore create an artificial, quote-to-quote, space in the urban environment that is being populated by living organisms. We did that project in the Connect Ort here in Barcelona, and there is a prototype that you can visit. You can also get some tomatoes to eat, but it was interesting to do the process together with the citizens, no? With the neighbors, that each one has different background. They are not scientists, they are not experts, but they really want to have a space in order to cultivate their food, but also in order to interact with their mates. And I said that briefly, but I want to highlight the fact that this kind of living spaces, they require us people. So it's not like that we are designing for bees or designing for plants and tomatoes, but we're really designing spaces that they need to coexist together with humans, because humans are a very fundamental part of it. We need to maintain them, but it's not just a maintenance idea, it is an idea of care, because we need to take care of them, because we know that the better we take care of them, the better they will give us and feed us literally and metaphorically. So I think that this also opens up this important idea of I think that in the post-Anthropocene we have been discussing about designing for other species, but sometimes we seem to forget the human intelligence or the crowd intelligence. And I'm saying that especially within the mainstream idea of the smart city, where we have, let's say, laid our confidence into quantitative data, but we can hardly understand what people feel, what people need, or let's say what I call the small data or the qualitative data. How can this become a part of a much more optimized process so that we can design cities for citizens? And this is a project, and I know I'm talking about people and I'm showing maps and drawings, but this is a project where what we actually did is that through a survey of different people in the area of Barcelona, we have gathered data on where people wanted to potentially have an urban orchard, and then we overlaid that with quantified data on soil exposure, soil quality, sun exposure, soil quality, and then try to be able to actually make a proposal that includes not only this idea of quantitative, but also the qualitative. And of course, last but not least, the computational intelligence is another species for me, is becoming another species every time more and more. It radically changes the way that we do design, we think about design, we materialize our design in some cases. So I think that trying to understand that within a very let's say, following philosophical also ideas of people like Rosi Braidotti or Donna Haraway or Timothy Morton, it is very important to understand that we need to acknowledge the others, which are not just human or non-humans, but they are also technological and cultural others. And that becomes a kind of a different way of how we co-design. And of course, it is a bit driving us towards this kind of collective intelligence or co-design processes. Of course, there are many different questions arising, like who designs, who decides within this kind of very complex processes of collective intelligence, but it's definitely a paradigm that is trying to mitigate our contaminating and our, let's say, consumptive aspect of the built environment, and it is definitely one that we need to give space to think about in terms of both potentials and also limitations. I will just finish maybe by showcasing 3 books that I have been involved in, and they are very much related with the topic. The Black Ecologist Journal of IAG is discussing exactly this idea of merge of different cultural, technological, natural, and human species. The Learning Cities is a collective intelligence design paradigm for the urban design, which merges artificial with crowd intelligence. And last but not least, the edible or the architecture of metabolism that we have co-curated together with Lydia Kalipoliti opens up the possibility of how we can design with vegetable intelligence and towards food production and food mitigation. So thank you everybody, and I'm really looking forward to discuss this opening up of co-design processes.
Thank you so much, Areti. I mean, it's thrilling to see really how advanced the thinking and the production is in Europe. One thing that I think I forgot to mention is that the US, along with the Vatican, are not following the UN's Convention for Biological Diversity. And I think the initiatives that Europe has set forth, the European Green Deal, it is clear that in Europe, biodiversity is being treasured and really funded and supported. And I think, Areti, the work that you showed is so, it's deep and brilliant and multi-layered. It's really inspiring to see how you are interweaving these different intelligences. I think you're asking some amazing questions, especially when it points to this notion of care. And I think we could ask about how do notions of maintenance and care connect maybe to the curatorial project of radical empathy, that taking care of something means a certain kinship, a certain emotional connection with the fabric of your city, with its materials, with it may imply a different sense of being a citizen. And I don't know if you're familiar with ideas of citizen science, that you as citizens may contribute to scientific data by producing a photograph of a bee that's geotagged and uploaded to iSeek or something like that, that builds, we understand increasingly how extremely valuable broad distributions of data are, and I think your work really shows that in bringing, I mean, the city as a collective space for intelligence. I think we have about sort of 10 minutes for discussion. I'm not sure, you gave us so much. There's design, care, maintenance, citizenship, empathy. Where do we begin?
Well, you know, one thing that I was thinking, especially also with this installation, is the fact that there is a necessity of an urgency, better said, of changing mindset towards certain ways of thinking. And, we sometimes, especially from the academic environment, we develop solutions or ideas, and sometimes we're lucky enough to have pilot projects in the city where we can assess the impact. But the truth is that not only the industry, but the users either are ready for some of these changes. No, we are discussing about an architecture that is, somehow breaks apart, collapses. It's biodegrades, it attracts other species. We start to discuss about a very we are collapsing this idea of dichotomy that has been very much integrated in the way that we think about what a building is. No, it's a shelter. It's a separation from what is outside and what is inside. Same goes with the scale of the city. Like these traditional dichotomies of inside, outside, waste, resource, users, non-users, like habitats, non-habitats. I think this is something that is definitely a challenge on how, on the one hand, change the mindset of what is this new paradigm introduces in terms of aesthetics, in terms of complexities, in terms of non-sterilized environments, on the one hand. And then, of course, what are the policies? What are the policies that we need to start integrating and implementing and introducing so that big part of the mass construction or production of architecture that is happening today can slightly change, Because also otherwise it seems that we are in a very utopian place, like very far away from the reality. And that's always a challenge.
I think it's also, among these challenges of changing the mindset, you mentioned this idea of cooking one's material. I think there are metaphors or practices even that we can take from our everyday life of cooking a meal to cooking a habitat, to practices of care that are very intimate, domestic, that have to do with a certain kind of empathy with the materials of your everyday that maybe are quite different from how we consider the city as a space of efficiency or, as you said, Areti, of being inside a certain glazed envelope to be productive in a certain way. I mean, I think that there are real aspirations for change that we may be able to get at through new materials, but we do encounter a whole series of regulations. My context is always the American context, but the Food and Drug Administration regulates basically a great deal that you could put in contact with humans that might affect their human health. I think there is the need for some policy change about how does the city contribute to health? How there are many studies that suggest that a more biophilic or biodiverse landscape contributes to human health, but these are not really factored into city code or building code, certainly not. And I think there is a level, for me, the use of monitoring technology is precisely that. It is to create data in a language that affects policy, because without the changes of policy, these remain very demonstration projects and very academic projects. And I think, I'd love to hear, your work seems to take the production of data in a very similar way, that you're seeing its import. I can say for my case, we have worked with Microsoft's AI for Earth, so it's a very large infrastructure that gathers pieces of data about different elements of biodiversity. Are there similar sort of large-scale efforts that you're plugging into, or do you find that these are ones you're almost growing yourself?
Well, I think that it's also interesting the fact that everything related to the Anthropocene has been only brought to our eyes with the use of data and technology. No? Without the data or technology, we wouldn't actually be able to understand the impact of our human impact in the planet. The truth is that Europe is in a kind of a privileged place, no? In comparison with big other parts of the world, that they are still not very much trying to integrate this into policies. It is true that a lot of different initiatives, including, for example, the new the European Green Deal or big part of funding that is coming from the European Commission for research is very much focused on enhancing biodiversity, like from programs such as the from farm to fork, from farm to fork, that's the one. I mean, this kind of, new programs that they already start to integrate projects that would become policies on how can we, like increase production in cities. The data issue is something that I believe we are still very much into a starting point. And that is because, and I really liked your comment on the citizen science, that is because everything has been seen as a kind of a top-down process. I'm not sure if anybody from the City Council of Barcelona is here today, but when Barcelona, within this kind of competition to become the smartest city, started to sign contracts with telecommunication companies that were promising technology that would position the city into these competitive top cities of the world in terms of intelligence, we have signed, not we, but the city have signed agreements that they couldn't even realize, what would it mean in terms of data privacy or in terms of what they were giving away. And I think that this has happened because we see data as a kind of a top-down process, that we need to have this kind of centralized or distributed infrastructure that is always centralized in terms of where data comes from or who is measuring it and who is processing them. And there is indeed a big potential into citizen science where each one of us could become part of that in a way that can offer us also higher accuracy. We're working a lot with speculation and simulation in data, but increasing accuracy becomes something very fundamental in order to understand certain phenomena related to the urban or to the biodiversity of the urban, such as the one that you were mentioning. And that also requires a change of mentality in how people realize that they could be part of this change, and want to be part of this change. So.
Well, I think we invite you to become citizen scientists using your phone. Really, there's a number of ways that simply taking pictures and uploading them is a gesture and actually contributes to this distribution of data. I think we are ready to move to the next stage of the program. Perhaps we can also entreat you to stay and have a few strawberries that we will be bringing out soon. Strawberries are one among many fruit that need native bees. So we encourage you to stay, enjoy some berries, and enjoy the rest of this next stage of discussion with Madeline McGowan, with Albena Yaneva, and with Christian Alonso.